Picture this. You're an Ottoman soldier marching toward what should be an easy victory, when suddenly you see them. 20,000 of your comrades impaled on massive wooden stakes, their bodies slowly rotting in the sun as a warning to anyone who dares challenge the man they call the Impaler. This isn't some Hollywood horror movie. This actually happened in 15th century Romania, orchestrated by a ruler so terrifyingly creative in his cruelty that his methods of torture became legendary throughout Europe and the Ottoman Empire. Vlad III, known as Vlad the Impaler, didn't just kill his enemies, he turned their deaths into psychological warfare so brutal that entire armies would flee at the mere mention of his name. What you're about to discover about his torture methods will make Game of Thrones look like a children's fairy tale. Hit subscribe right now, because what this medieval psychopath did to human beings will haunt your nightmares and change everything you thought you knew about historical cruelty. Vlad III. Dracula, born around 1431 in Transylvania, wasn't born a monster. He was systematically created into one through a childhood so traumatic that it would have destroyed most people's capacity for empathy and human connection. His father, Vlad II Dracul, was a member of the Order of the Dragon, a Christian military organization dedicated to fighting the expanding Ottoman Empire, which is how the family acquired the name Dracula, meaning son of the dragon. However, the political realities of 15th century Eastern Europe meant that survival often required making deals with the very enemies you were supposed to fight. The defining trauma of Vlad's childhood occurred when he was just 11 years old, as his father made a desperate political alliance with the Ottoman Sultan Murad II to maintain his throne in Wallachia. As part of this agreement, Vlad and his younger brother Radu were sent to the Ottoman court as hostages, essentially prisoners who would be executed if their father betrayed the alliance. This wasn't a diplomatic exchange. It was childhood imprisonment in a foreign court, where the boys were constantly reminded that their lives hung by the thinnest of political threads. The years Vlad spent as an Ottoman hostage exposed him to levels of political cruelty and calculated violence that would shape his understanding of power for the rest of his life. The Ottoman court was notorious for its sophisticated torture methods and psychological manipulation techniques, which young Vlad observed firsthand as various political prisoners and rebellious subjects were brought before the Sultan for punishment. These experiences taught him that fear was the most effective tool of governance and that creative cruelty could accomplish what conventional military force could not. The contrast between Vlad and his brother Radu during their captivity reveals how the same traumatic experiences can create completely different responses in different individuals. While Radu adapted to Ottoman culture and eventually converted to Islam, earning favor with his captors, Vlad maintained a sullen resistance that was repeatedly punished through beatings, isolation, and psychological torture. The Ottomans seemed to understand that they were dealing with a fundamentally different type of personality in Vlad, one that would never be truly broken, but could be twisted into something far more dangerous. The return to Wallachia in 1448 marked the beginning of Vlad's transformation from traumatized hostage into the monster that would terrorize Eastern Europe for decades. His father and older brother had been assassinated by political rivals, leaving 16-year-old Vlad as the rightful heir to a throne that was constantly contested by Ottoman-backed rivals, Hungarian-backed claimants, and local boyars who preferred weak rulers they could manipulate. The young prince understood immediately that conventional political methods would never be sufficient to maintain power in such a chaotic environment. The political instability that characterized Vlad's early reign forced him to develop increasingly extreme methods of dealing with enemies, as traditional diplomatic and military approaches proved inadequate against the complex web of foreign and domestic threats he faced. His first executions were relatively conventional by medieval standards, but as he discovered the psychological impact that creative cruelty could have on his enemies, his methods became progressively more elaborate and terrifying. The historical sources that document Vlad's early reign show a clear progression from a young ruler struggling to maintain power through conventional means to a calculating psychopath who discovered that extreme cruelty could be more effective than armies, diplomacy, or political alliances. The transformation wasn't gradual. It was a deliberate decision to embrace methods that most rulers would have considered too extreme, even by the brutal standards of medieval warfare, revealing a mind that had been permanently damaged by childhood trauma and had learned to weaponize that damage against his enemies. Vlad's signature method of execution wasn't simply sticking people on spikes. It was a carefully engineered system of prolonged torture that he refined through experimentation until he could guarantee that victims would suffer for hours or even days before finally dying. Historical accounts from Ottoman chroniclers, Saxon merchants, and papal representatives all describe the meticulous attention to detail that Vlad applied to perfecting impalement as both a method of execution and a tool of psychological warfare against anyone who might consider opposing him. The technical aspects of Vlad's impalement method reveal a mind that approached torture with the same systematic precision that other rulers applied to military engineering or architectural projects. The stakes used for impalement were carefully prepared wooden poles, usually made from oak or other hardwood that wouldn't break under the weight of a human body. These poles were sharpened to a specific point that was sharp enough to penetrate flesh, but not so sharp that it would cause immediate death by piercing vital organs too quickly. The positioning and insertion of the stake required knowledge of human anatomy that Vlad had apparently acquired through extensive practice and experimentation on prisoners. The stake was inserted through the rectum or vagina and pushed slowly through the body, carefully avoiding major organs like the heart and lungs that would cause immediate death. The goal was to have the stake emerge through the chest, shoulder, or neck, while leaving the victim alive and conscious for the maximum amount of time possible. The height at which victims were mounted on their stakes was calculated to maximize their visibility from great distances, while ensuring that the weight of their own bodies would gradually force them further down onto the stakes over time. This created a horrifying situation where victims were essentially forced to participate in their own slow execution, as any struggle or movement would accelerate the process of the stake moving through their body. Some historical accounts describe victims remaining alive and conscious for up to 3 days, begging for water or calling out to family members who were often impaled on nearby stakes. The arrangement of impaled bodies into what became known as forests of the impaled demonstrates Vlad's understanding of the psychological impact that mass displays of cruelty could have on both his own subjects and foreign enemies. These forests were strategically positioned along major roads and near battlefields where they would be encountered by travelers, merchants, diplomats, and military forces. The sight of hundreds or thousands of slowly dying people arranged in organized rows created a psychological shock that went far beyond what individual executions could accomplish. The variations that Vlad developed in his impalement technique show that he treated torture as a form of creative expression, adapting his methods to create different psychological effects depending on his audience and objectives. Children were sometimes impaled alongside their parents, creating scenes of family destruction that were designed to terrorize communities into submission. Religious figures were impaled in positions that mocked their sacred roles, while political enemies were subjected to enhanced versions of the basic technique that could prolong their suffering for even longer periods. The medical aspects of surviving impalement were documented by contemporary physicians who were horrified by what they witnessed in Vlad's territory. The human body's response to this type of trauma involves a complex combination of shock, blood loss, infection, and organ failure. But Vlad's technique was designed to manage these factors in ways that would maximize suffering while preventing immediate death. The psychological trauma experienced by victims was considered by observers to be even worse than the physical pain, as the slow nature of the death gave people time to fully comprehend what was happening to them. The international reaction to reports of Vlad's impalement techniques reveals how his methods exceeded even the brutal standards of medieval warfare, with military leaders and political figures throughout Europe expressing shock and horror at descriptions of his torture forests. Modern psychological analysis of Vlad's documented behavior patterns reveals characteristics that align perfectly with what we now recognize as psychopathic personality disorder combined with post-traumatic stress disorder from his childhood captivity, and a calculating intelligence that made him one of history's most effective practitioners of psychological warfare. Unlike many historical figures whose cruelty appeared to stem from rage or religious fanaticism, Vlad's torture methods demonstrate the cold, systematic approach of someone who understood exactly how to manipulate human psychology for maximum effect. The childhood trauma that Vlad experienced as an Ottoman hostage created the perfect conditions for developing antisocial personality traits, as he learned at an early age that emotional connections were dangerous liabilities, and that survival depended on his ability to be more ruthless than his enemies. Psychological research on childhood captivity shows that children who experience prolonged imprisonment and torture often develop either complete emotional shutdown or hyper-aggressive responses to perceived threats, and Vlad clearly fell into the latter category. The systematic nature of Vlad's cruelty suggests that he possessed what psychologists call instrumental aggression, violence that is used as a tool to achieve specific goals rather than as an emotional outlet. Every one of his documented torture sessions served clear political or military purposes: intimidating enemies, preventing rebellion, gathering intelligence, or demonstrating power to potential allies. This calculated approach to extreme violence indicates a level of emotional detachment that allowed him to treat human suffering as simply another resource to be managed and deployed. The pleasure that contemporary sources suggest Vlad derived from witnessing torture reveals another classic characteristic of psychopathic personality: the complete absence of empathy combined with a fascination with others' pain and suffering. Multiple historical accounts describe Vlad personally supervising impalement sessions, sometimes eating meals while watching victims die, and showing visible enjoyment when prisoners begged for mercy or tried to bargain for their lives. This behavior goes beyond simple cruelty into the realm of sadistic personality disorder. The strategic intelligence that Vlad demonstrated in his use of torture as psychological warfare shows that his psychopathy was combined with exceptional cognitive abilities that made him far more dangerous than a simple sadist. He understood that the fear generated by his reputation could accomplish military and political objectives that would have required much larger armies and resources to achieve through conventional means. Enemy forces would abandon their campaigns rather than face the possibility of impalement, while domestic opposition collapsed when people realized the consequences of resistance. The religious and cultural justifications that Vlad developed for his extreme methods reveal how psychopathic individuals often rationalize their behavior through ideological frameworks that make their actions seem not only acceptable, but morally necessary. Vlad positioned himself as a defender of Christianity against Islamic invasion, arguing that extreme measures were required to protect his people from Ottoman conquest. This religious framing allowed him to present his torture methods as acts of holy war rather than expressions of personal sadism. The relationship between Vlad's psychological profile and his political effectiveness demonstrates how certain types of mental disorders can actually provide advantages in specific historical contexts, particularly during periods of extreme political instability and constant warfare. His complete lack of empathy and his willingness to use unlimited violence made him highly effective at maintaining power in a region where conventional rulers were quickly overthrown or assassinated by their enemies. The long-term psychological impact of Vlad's methods on his own society reveals how psychopathic leadership can create lasting cultural trauma that persists long after the individual leader is gone. The population of Wallachia became so terrorized by his methods that they developed a collective psychological condition that contemporary observers compared to shell shock, with entire communities living in constant fear of arbitrary execution and torture for generations after his death. In 1462, when Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II launched a massive invasion of Wallachia with an army of 90,000 soldiers, he expected to crush Vlad's much smaller force and end the Impaler's reign of terror once and for all. Instead, the Sultan's army encountered what became known as the Forest of the Impaled. 20,000 Ottoman prisoners of war and Wallachian civilians suspected of Ottoman sympathies, all impaled on stakes arranged in a massive display that stretched for miles along the approach to Targovist, Vlad's capital city. This wasn't just mass execution. It was psychological warfare on a scale that had never been attempted before in human history. The logistical planning required to create this forest of corpses reveals the industrial scale of Vlad's cruelty and his understanding of how to maximize the psychological impact of mass torture. The 20,000 stakes had to be prepared, sharpened, and positioned with mathematical precision to create the maximum visual impact, while the impalement process itself required hundreds of executioners working in coordinated teams over several weeks. The systematic nature of this operation demonstrates that Vlad had essentially created a torture infrastructure that could process thousands of victims efficiently and effectively. The strategic positioning of the impaled bodies was carefully calculated to force the advancing Ottoman army to march through the forest for hours, ensuring that every soldier would be forced to witness the fate that awaited them if they continued their invasion. The stakes were arranged in order of height and positioned so that the advancing army would encounter increasingly horrific displays as they moved deeper into Wallachian territory. Children were impaled on shorter stakes at the forest's edge, while adult prisoners were mounted on progressively taller stakes that displayed their suffering more prominently. The psychological impact on the Ottoman forces was immediate and devastating, with contemporary chroniclers describing how the invading army's morale collapsed as soldiers realized they were marching through what amounted to a preview of their own potential fate. Many soldiers began deserting before they even encountered Vlad's military forces, while others became so psychologically traumatized by what they witnessed that they were unable to function effectively in combat. The Sultan himself was reportedly so horrified by the display that he considered abandoning the invasion entirely. The international reaction to reports of the Forest of the Impaled spread throughout Europe and the Ottoman Empire, creating a reputation for Vlad that exceeded anything achieved by previous medieval rulers. Diplomatic correspondence from the period shows that foreign courts were struggling to comprehend how a single individual could orchestrate such systematic cruelty, while military leaders began developing new strategies specifically designed to avoid confronting Vlad's forces directly. The preservation and documentation of the Forest of the Impaled by contemporary observers reveals how this single act of mass torture became a turning point in medieval warfare, demonstrating that psychological terror could be more effective than traditional military tactics. Ottoman chroniclers who accompanied the invasion force wrote detailed descriptions of what they witnessed, creating historical records that preserved the horror for future generations while simultaneously spreading Vlad's reputation throughout the Islamic world. The civilian population's response to the Forest of the Impaled shows how Vlad's methods affected not just his enemies, but also his own people, creating a climate of terror that made effective resistance to his rule virtually impossible. Wallachian peasants and nobles alike understood that anyone could end up impaled if they were suspected of disloyalty, creating a population that was too terrorized to oppose their ruler even when they disagreed with his methods. The long-term military consequences of the Forest of the Impaled included changes in Ottoman strategic planning and the development of new military doctrines designed specifically to deal with enemies who employed extreme psychological warfare, demonstrating how Vlad's methods influenced military thinking throughout the region for decades after his death. Beyond impalement, Vlad developed an extensive repertoire of torture methods that demonstrated his systematic approach to breaking human psychology and his understanding of how different types of cruelty could achieve specific political and military objectives. These techniques were so innovative and effective that reports of them spread throughout Europe and the Ottoman Empire, creating a reputation that often made armies retreat before they even engaged his forces in battle. His torture innovations weren't random acts of sadism. They were carefully designed tools of statecraft that he employed with the precision of a master craftsman. The flaying technique that Vlad perfected involved the systematic removal of skin from living victims in patterns that maximized pain, while ensuring that the process would take hours or days to complete. Unlike crude medieval flaying that simply tore skin away randomly, Vlad's method involved making precise incisions that would allow the skin to be peeled away in strips while keeping the victim conscious and aware throughout the entire process. This technique was particularly effective against captured enemy leaders, as their prolonged screaming could be heard for miles and served as psychological warfare against their own troops. The boiling alive method that Vlad employed was enhanced through his use of graduated temperature increases that prevented victims from losing consciousness too quickly due to shock. Rather than simply throwing people into boiling water, his executioners would begin with lukewarm water and gradually increase the temperature while the victim was held in place, creating a torture experience that could last for hours while generating screams that could be heard throughout his territory. This method was often used against merchants accused of dishonest business practices, creating a powerful deterrent effect on commercial activity. The creative applications of traditional torture devices that Vlad developed showed his understanding of how to modify existing methods to create maximum psychological impact. His use of the breaking wheel involved positioning victims so that their breaking bones would create specific sounds that could be heard by assembled crowds, while his enhanced version of drawing and quartering used specially trained horses that would pull at precisely calculated speeds to prolong the dismemberment process. The mass torture spectacles that Vlad organized transformed individual executions into community events that served multiple psychological and political purposes simultaneously. These events were carefully choreographed to create maximum emotional impact on spectators while demonstrating the ruler's absolute power over life and death. Entire families would be tortured together in sequences designed to force parents to watch their children suffering before experiencing their own deaths, creating trauma that would affect witnesses for the rest of their lives. The intelligence-gathering applications of Vlad's torture methods reveal how he understood that extreme pain could be used not just for execution, but also for extracting information that conventional interrogation techniques could never obtain. His systematic approach to breaking prisoners' resistance involved psychological manipulation, combined with physical torture in sequences that would gradually destroy a person's ability to maintain secrets or loyalty to their original cause. The religious and cultural modifications that Vlad made to traditional torture techniques demonstrated his understanding of how to use his enemies' own beliefs and cultural values against them. Muslim prisoners were subjected to tortures that specifically violated Islamic religious principles, while Christian enemies faced methods that perverted their sacred rituals and beliefs. These culturally specific torture techniques created additional layers of psychological trauma that went beyond physical pain. The diplomatic applications of Vlad's torture innovations included his use of elaborate execution displays to send specific messages to foreign courts and military leaders. Enemy ambassadors were sometimes forced to witness torture sessions before being released to carry reports back to their rulers, while the bodies of executed prisoners were arranged in ways that communicated detailed threats and warnings to anyone considering military or political action against Wallachia. The technological innovations that Vlad developed to support his torture methods included specialized tools and architectural modifications that allowed for more efficient and effective implementation of his various techniques, creating an infrastructure of cruelty that could process large numbers of victims with systematic precision. Vlad's death in December 1476 came not through the elaborate torture he had inflicted on thousands of others, but in a relatively conventional battle against Ottoman forces near Bucharest, where he was killed either by enemy soldiers who didn't recognize him or by his own men who had grown tired of his increasingly paranoid and unpredictable behavior. The irony of this mundane ending to such an extraordinary life of cruelty wasn't lost on contemporary observers, who noted that the man who had terrorized Eastern Europe for decades died in the same way as countless ordinary soldiers throughout history. The immediate aftermath of Vlad's death saw a complex mixture of relief, fear, and uncertainty throughout Wallachia and neighboring regions, as people struggled to understand how to live in a world without the constant threat of arbitrary torture and execution that had defined their existence for decades. Many of his subjects had become so psychologically dependent on the structure that his reign of terror provided that they found the sudden absence of absolute authority more frightening than its presence had been. The preservation of Vlad's head as a trophy by the Ottoman Sultan, who had finally defeated him, demonstrates how his reputation had transcended normal political and military rivalries to become a symbol of absolute evil that needed to be definitively destroyed. The head was reportedly preserved in honey and sent to Constantinople, where it was displayed publicly to prove that the infamous Impaler was finally dead and could no longer terrorize the region. The legend-making process that began immediately after Vlad's death shows how his extreme methods had created a reputation that would outlive his actual historical significance and transform him from a relatively minor medieval ruler into one of history's most notorious figures. German merchants who had suffered under his rule began producing pamphlets and woodcut illustrations that spread stories of his cruelty throughout Europe, while Ottoman chroniclers preserved detailed accounts of his torture methods for posterity. The influence of Vlad's methods on subsequent military and political leaders reveals how his innovations in psychological warfare became part of the toolkit that other rulers would employ when conventional approaches proved insufficient. His techniques for using extreme cruelty as a deterrent and his understanding of how mass torture could achieve strategic objectives influenced military thinking and political practice throughout Eastern Europe and the Ottoman Empire for centuries after his death. The cultural transformation of Vlad into the vampire Dracula represents one of history's most successful examples of how real historical cruelty can be mythologized into fictional entertainment that obscures the actual human suffering that occurred. Bram Stoker's 1897 novel and the countless films and books that followed have created a popular culture version of Vlad that bears little resemblance to the historical figure but has made him more famous than he ever could have become through his actual deeds. The modern psychological and historical analysis of Vlad's methods has provided valuable insights into how extreme trauma can create individuals capable of inflicting systematic cruelty on unprecedented scales, while also revealing the political and social conditions that allow such individuals to achieve and maintain power. His case has become a subject of study for psychologists, historians, and military strategists seeking to understand the mechanics of mass violence and psychological warfare. The terrifying truth about Vlad the Impaler is that he wasn't some supernatural monster from a horror story. He was a human being whose childhood trauma and psychological disorders combined with political opportunity to create one of history's most effective practitioners of systematic cruelty. His methods were so successful that they influenced warfare and statecraft for centuries, proving that the most frightening monsters aren't mythical creatures, but ordinary people who discover how to weaponize human suffering for political gain. If this shocking journey into the mind of a medieval psychopath left you speechless, smash that like button. Subscribe for more hidden truths about history's darkest figures, and ring that notification bell. Because the real stories of human cruelty are far more terrifying than any fiction Hollywood could ever create.